Hello, hello. Welcome back to Loki's Librarian. If you are new here, welcome. I am your librarian, Katrina, and I do a book review a week, mixing up a cocktail while I review it, and this is called Books and Booze. It is the last Sunday of July 2024, so it's time for our next president book, which is Lyndon B. Johnson, making this week's book of the week. Lyndon B. Johnson, Portrait of a President by Robert Dallek. The accompanying cocktail is a mudslide, which the recipe I found is for two, so you can have this to get half. I happen to love mudslides. I've had them before, so the first time I'm making them at home, but I have had them before. They're delicious, so I don't mind making a double dose. It is 4 ounces of vodka, 2 ounces of Kahlua, 2 ounces of Bailey's, and a quarter cup of heavy cream. Then you pour it all into a glass that has chocolate syrup in it, which I didn't mean to go that heavy on the chocolate syrup, but this is going to basically be a very sweet treat. Now you can make this shaken or frozen. To do it frozen, you put it in a blender with ice, which is what I'm going to do. Let's do this. Lyndon Baines Johnson was born August 27th, 1908, near Stonewall, Texas, to Samuel Ely Johnson Jr. and Rebecca Baines Johnson. Oldest of 5 children, he had 1 brother and 3 sisters. The family was poor, and he grew up poor. I mean, this is not one of those wealthy political families that, although there were politics there, his father, Samuel, was a local politician, but local. This wasn't a national thing. This was just what he did locally. And so there was certainly politics in his blood. Now, Johnson was a bit of a shit as a kid. But then again, who isn't? So it's a little hard to judge him on that. Lord knows I was not a perfect child. When he got out of high school, and I feel like he graduated young. I think he was like 16 when he graduated. He ran away to California because his parents wanted him to go to college and get a job, and he wasn't sure if that was for him. So he went to California for a little bit before returning to Texas, where he decided he was going to go to college, but only after he got into a bar brawl where he got his ass handed to him by one of the local yokels. And he decided that being a street tough was not for him after all. So he went to college instead. Now, this part of the book was very informative. It kind of it was a very forceful reminder that our politicians are all too human. I know that most people like to put them on pedestals. Don't do that. They are all too human. And in this case, his humanity came out as treating people not the best unless they were kissing his ass. There you go. He had this habit of treating people that, and this kind of runs thematically throughout the book. If they were kissing his ass, he would be very nice to them. If they were useful to him, he would be very nice to them. Otherwise, he had no earthly use to them and would treat them like absolute dog shit. Sometimes, and he was a hellish boss to work for, he would treat them like absolute dog shit just because he wanted to keep them on their toes. So yeah, sounds like an absolute peach to work for. Okay, this is going to get very loud. All right. I was going to bring me a straw, but I didn't. Anyways, here we go. Now, he did go to college. He graduated from college. He actually worked briefly as a teacher, where he was probably one of the better paid teachers at the time. I don't remember exactly, but it was like $130 a week, which sounds like peanuts, but this was, the late 1920s, right before the Depression hit, so it was actually pretty solid. Before he worked as secretary to Congressman Kleberg starting in 1931, wherein he basically had free rein to act on Kleberg's behalf. And Kleberg was kind of one of the good old boys who just wanted to be there for the food and the whiskey, and he let Johnson have basically free rein. This ultimately led to LBJ being put in charge of the FDR program, National Youth Administration in Texas. So he was in charge of that organization's role in Texas. And it was during this time that he would meet and marry Claudia Lady Bird Taylor in 1934. And may I just say, she was absolutely stunningly beautiful. Let me see if I find her picture, I will put it up here. But a young Lady Bird was like, my God, how did he get her? Because she was genuinely gorgeous. That was a tangent. I didn't mean to go there. Let's see here. They would be married for 10 years before they had their 2 surviving children. I think she had a miscarriage before that, but I'm not going to be swear to that. I might be missing up my first ladies. They did have 2 daughters, Linda Bird and Lucy Baines, who they're both still alive, actually. As congressman, LBJ was a staunch New Dealer. It was probably this unflagging support for FDR's policies that earned him his assistance from FDR with his Hatch Act violations in 1941. I mentioned that during the FDR review a few months ago. During his first attempt, Johnson's first attempt to become a senator, which happened in 41 because of the death of the senior senator from Texas, Morris Shepherd. Hence, incidentally, the mudslide cocktail. I mean, LBG did eventually win his Senate seat by the skin of his teeth. He jokingly said that he was Landslide Lyndon, which title he would renew when he won the presidency. But mudslide is more accurate because it's dirtier. Although, to be fair, his political opponents were just as dirty. It's not like this was unique to Johnson, all right? They were all just dirty as hell, playing as dirty as they could get to power. I really do love mudslides. Should be careful because I still also have to edit this video. Whatever. Now, while serving as congressman, Johnson also served as an officer with the Navy Reserves in World War II. He used his pull with the president to get him assigned to as like a brief inspection tour of the Southwest Pacific, including stops in Pearl Harbor, Australia, and New Zealand. He served on exactly one combat mission after talking his way onto a bombing run against Japanese bases, and it sounds like he kind of made himself a nuisance on the planes with the regular crew members. Quote, "During the 1-hour flight to the target, Johnson was all over the plane, seeing everything he could." End quote. So he's kind of running all over, being a general pain in the ass while the men are trying to get ready for this bombing run. The plane he was on, the heckling hare, lost power in one engine and had to jettison their bombs and drop out of formation before returning back to base. Their return flight was harried by Japanese, but the pilot, Walter Greer, was more than up to the task, and they all got back safely. Now, after landing, Johnson gave a report of the run to General MacArthur, who announced Johnson would receive a Silver Star for this. Not sure for what, but he did. The crew members who had been shot down on another plane on the mission received Purple Hearts, and the only one to receive the Silver Star was Johnson. Who knows? Who knows why? Part of his political back-scratching. If I had to guess, MacArthur saw it as a way to get LBJ out of his hair. And it worked, too. After this, Johnson returned stateside and went back to being a congressman. Now, after he returned, the IRS began their investigation of his creative bookkeeping during his 1941 Senate race, and the White House stepped in and ordered the IRS to stop their investigation, lest it ruin the political future of one Lyndon Baines Johnson. It was during this time that LBJ began to build his wealth by purchasing, I believe it was a radio station first. I mean, he eventually expanded into TV, but it started with the radio station. And this served a dual purpose. I mean, it gave Lady Bird something to do with her time, since the couple at this point didn't have children yet. He was also worried about his political future, which was in very real danger with the IRS investigation looming. Now, this is important to note because I know it's all too easy to assume dirty politics, at least for our current Congress critters, because how the hell do they get to be millionaires when they're sitting in Congress? Well, Johnson managed to become a millionaire while being a congressman, but as near as we can tell, all of his wealth building was completely above board and honest. It was completely legal for him to own the radio station. And when the FCC eventually changed rules so you couldn't own both television and radio stations, he sold one of them to stay within compliance. He didn't try and argue, oh, I'm grandfathered in or anything dumb like that. He played within the rules, and he was very careful to accumulate his wealth above board. And he played dirty politically, but kept his income streams clean, which is smart. He got his next chance at running for Senate in 1948, and that's the one he won, and he began to aggressively push for the passage of legislation. I think I mentioned last month, and if I didn't, then I'm sorry, it was definitely a theme of last month's book, is that Kennedy was looking to make a mark in the Senate to increase his chances of a presidential nomination, and Johnson made that mark. He pushed for passage of more and more legislation to get a legislative record behind himself. He became, I think, the youngest minority whip and eventually a Senate majority leader. And politics were his milieu. I mean, he was very at home in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. He knew how to work people to ensure that he got his way. He knew when bullying would land the prize and when he needed to kindly hold their hand. I mean, he knew when to play party politics and when he needed to pull it back to a bipartisan level. He was very, very good at that. All of this led to his first heart attack in 1955. I mean, you work constantly, you don't sleep, you smoke 3 packs a day, and you eat like shit, you're probably going to have a heart attack. Also, if you drink a lot, you're probably going to have a heart attack, so I should probably just bear that in mind. Well, a heart attack almost derailed his career, obviously. But he did bounce back eventually, and he was kept on track, and he just kind of kept on trucking, mostly by following doctor recommendations on diet, and he quit smoking. In 1956, he was approached by the patriarch of the Kennedy clan, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., with an offer to back Johnson for a presidential bid with JFK as his VP. And this was an offer which Johnson turned down. I mean, he realized that he was being used as a stalking horse to push for Kennedy presidency. Basically, they were going to put his name forward as an unlikely candidate just to get Kennedy's name up for the nomination. And that was 56. So it was with some surprise 4 years later that the Kennedy clan approached him for the VP position in 1960. And it's an offer he almost didn't take because he still had ambitions for the top spot himself. And the last vice president who had been elected to the position without his predecessor dying first was Martin Van Buren. Been over 100 years since a VP had ascended to the rank of president on an electoral thing, not because the guy died. So he almost said no, because who wants to get to the presidency that way, right? I mean, that's ghoulish. And he was also human. I think he had many flaws, but I'm pretty sure that is not one of them. He was as horrified as the rest of the world when Kennedy was assassinated. As vice president, Kennedy wanted to keep Johnson as far from himself as possible, given that Johnson was a masterful politician. So to that end, Kennedy would send Johnson basically on goodwill missions overseas, where Johnson would visit third world countries and hand out pens and lighters and tickets to visit the Senate gallery. No joke. All of this seems utterly ridiculous unless you look at it from the context of the times, all right? We were at the height of the Cold War. We were shooting for winning people over with our high ideas and ideals, and we were fighting the communists to do it. And we were trying to talk them into following America into democracy. Don't follow the Soviets, don't be communist, be democratic like us. And so by handing out these tchotchkes, he was demonstrating that America was so well off we could just give these things away, things that cost a great deal of money to make in these countries and to own in these countries. He's just handing away lighters, handing away ballpoint pens, the clicky kind. And those were great gifts. They loved them. Not sure what they did with the Senate tickets, although I think there's an anecdote in there about one guy who did in fact come over and see the Senate gallery, and Johnson was a good host. He showed him around. I mean, good for him, right? And that's more or less how Johnson spent the first 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days of the Kennedy presidency. And then November 22nd, 1963 happened, and the world was horrified, not least of which is Johnson. I mean, that very famous photo of him being sworn in next to a blood-soaked Jacqueline Kennedy. He looks shook in that picture. I mean, clearly this is not how he wanted to get there, which is fair. I mean, like I said, only a true monster wants to get to that top spot by death of his running mate, right? This isn't even an opponent who died for you to get there. This is your political party, your compatriot. He's on the same side as you, same side as. Theoretically, we're all on the same side. We're all Americans. And then there's the reality of what we live in today, which says otherwise. But he stepped in, and he obviously took the oath. That was his job. He stepped in, and to his absolute credit, he took his cue from Chester A. Arthur, who, if you'll remember from 2023, a little over a year ago, Arthur believed that the presidency wasn't his. His job was to complete the presidency of James Garfield. Johnson's job was to complete Kennedy's presidency. And to that end, he spent the remainder of Kennedy's term following the policies as laid out by Kennedy. And then Johnson ran 4-1 in his own right in 1964, and he did win by a landslide, believe it or not. I think he had 61% of the vote or something like that. It was some absurd amount. He was very high up there. And now he's president in his own right. Just as an aside, he absolutely mastered the negative ad campaign, including this absolute gem which aired, I think, once, and is still the talk of political campaigns 60 years later.
9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd.
And once he was sworn in, he immediately began wheeling, dealing, and strong-arming to get his Great Society legislation passed, which included a host of civil rights bills and welfare measures to assist the poor, lower taxes, and military spending to increase troop movements in Vietnam. Now, the Great Society legislation looks great on paper. And it has paid absolute dividends for anyone who ever supported the legislation on both sides of the aisle, right? Republican or Democrat. If you supported the Great Society legislation, it looks good for you, right? Because who wouldn't support more money to assist the poor and Medicare for retirees and fair and equal housing and civil rights? These things look good on paper. The problem was Vietnam. And the Great Society legislation has problems too, but Vietnam was his real bugaboo. And those pesky tax cuts. Because, see, everybody loved the tax cuts. Don't get me wrong, that was unarguably his most favored piece of legislation were tax cuts. Problem is, if you cut your taxes but don't also cut spending, you end up with massive deficits in your budget. And he had deficits until like the last 6 months of his presidency because he just couldn't balance those books because he kept spending money that he didn't have. He had to make budgetary allowances to fund the war in Vietnam, so he was never able to fully fund the Great Society programs, which has also, interestingly enough, paid dividends for the supporters, as they consistently point out that detractors have failed to fund those programs, which is why they don't work. We just don't have the funding for them. Never mind that the programs themselves are flawed, and Lord knows the administrators who run those programs are wonky as shit. It's because they're not funded properly. That's the real problem. Yeah. And rather than looking at the reality, which is if you pay people not to work, then they just won't work. I mean, we saw a lot of that during the COVID lockdowns. Anyways, it's neither here nor there. Now, the 60s were a tumultuous time. Not just the Great Society programs, but of course they had rioting. The rioting was not always just because of Vietnam. The rioting actually helped derail the Great Society legislation, as people were like, hey, we're trying to help the poor people in the black communities, and in return, you guys are rioting and causing millions of dollars of property damage, so maybe we should just stop helping you. Kind of create this cause and effect thing going on. It definitely cooled the reform for ardor among huge swaths of America. But Johnson's real problem was Vietnam. And this is interesting because apparently Johnson never read Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, "Let me never fall into the vulgar mistake of dreaming that I am persecuted whenever I am contradicted," because he believed he was persecuted as hell. I mean, he genuinely believed that those who disagreed with him were out to get him. And I don't think this was a paranoid delusion. I don't, and neither does the author. He actually mentions that in the book, that this wasn't a paranoid delusion. This was just the political climate that Johnson was living in. He hated hippie protesters, and there was a really great quote from him regarding the college protests, which he said to George Ball, quote, "Don't pay any attention to what those little shits on the campuses do. The great beast is the reactionary elements in the country. Those are the people that we have to fear." Isn't that lovely? College kids are little shits. They're also your next voting demographic, but he missed that one apparently. So he genuinely believed that if more people would support the war, we would be doing better. One thing that bothered me is fairly consistently the author would go through and would throw out lines like, X was popular and 70% of Americans backed it, without providing any proof of what the polling numbers were. If they only polled 100 people and 70 agreed with them, then 70% is true. Or is it more like this Family Guy situation?
Gentlemen, we got 20 calls about the David Hyde Pierce incident. And as you know, one call equals a billion people.
4 years on, and following the Tet Offensive of 1968, which America won, but seemed to kind of sap American desire to keep fighting. At least, did they win? I should ask my dad. Johnson announced that he did not choose to and would not accept another nomination for presidency. Right, he pulled a Kahlua Coolidge on everybody. He said, nope, not going to do this again. And he could have, by the way. The 22nd Amendment is worded as, quote, "No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice, and no person who has held the president or acted as president for more than 2 years of a term to which some other person was elected president shall be elected to the office of the president more than once." Basically, if Kennedy had been assassinated in 62 instead of 63, Johnson wouldn't have been eligible to run again. But because he only had 1 year left, Johnson was eligible, but he chose not to. He just didn't want to. Vietnam and the backlash at home over this quagmire had just worn him down. The Great Society was failing from lack of funding, and while it continues to more or less limp along even today, he just wasn't sure he would survive a second term. So he voluntarily withdrew from running in 68, and then managed to spoil Vice President Hubert Humphrey's chances at winning when he ran against Nixon. Just basically, I think that he wanted to be like a Teddy Roosevelt, who kind of controlled Taft for the first few months of Taft's presidency before, Teddy went off to go hunting in Africa. So when he came back, that he was like, I don't like what Taft's doing, I'm going to run again. And I think he wanted to do that, and Humphreys didn't give any indication that he was going to let him be a backseat driver. Excuse me. Nixon won, obviously, in 68, and Johnson retired to his ranch in Texas. I enjoyed this one. I enjoyed it a great deal more than I enjoyed the Kennedy book. I'm not sure how he managed to make Kennedy, who is arguably the most dynamic president we've ever had, into a boring book, but he surely did. But this one was much better organized. It flowed through. It didn't circle back the way the other one did. It humanized Johnson in a way I'm not sure was possible prior to reading this book. And I will admit that I have a great deal of bias here. I grew up listening to Tom Paxton.
Lyndon Johnson told the nation, have no fear of escalation. I am trying everyone to please. Though it isn't really war, we're sending 50,000 more to help save Vietnam from Vietnamese.
And his song basically ran on this never-ending loop in my brain while reading this book. I still have it running in my brain right now. Because my dad was one of those 50,000 more that Johnson sent to Vietnam to save it from the Vietnamese. So I have some strong opinions about Johnson. But Dallek managed to convince me that Johnson did actually care about the poor and underrepresented black communities. And I think he did want to do right by people. I also think he cared a great deal about being in power and staying in power. He cared about power, but the two goals are not mutually exclusive. He saw the bulk of America, those underrepresented classes, as being his ticket to power and to keeping power. So if he could buy votes with Great Society legislation, he could do some good and keep himself in the cockpit. So he saw it as a mutually beneficial arrangement between himself and the poverty-stricken of America. This book, very early on, highlighted the danger of worshiping our political leaders, quote unquote, the way we do these days. Right? We worship these people, and I can't for the life of me figure out why, because they are, after all, only all too human, including Johnson, who died at home on January 2nd, 1973. And that's it for this week. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you guys next Sunday. Bye.